Let's pray together. God, thanks for bringing us together this evening. Thank you for the rain outside, as long as it's not too much. Thank you for what I hope is warm places for each of us to be, even if it's cold and wet outside. And I ask that you bless us in this hour as we talk about just one of the many stories of the kings of your people and what we might be able to learn from that. We pray these things in your Son's name. Amen. So we are back exploring the history of the Bible to understand better what it means for us, and but also to get an eye for what it meant then and the stories that it told then. This has evolved now over time to be something that is as much about the stories that are in the text as it is about how the texts came about. But tonight's story points us in a direction to talk about how the people of God saw the Bible and how they used the Bible. And I just realized that I don't have a Bible here. So in a minute, I'm going to have to actually pause, hold for just a second, would you please? I made the mistake of tidying up. So back to where we were. Just a few reminder things about the stats of the Bible. 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. I hope this just rolls off your tongues the same way after we get done with this. We've been saying understanding the historical situation of each biblical text is key to understanding it, and then also understanding the kind of writing that it was helps us understand what's going on there. And so last week we talked about, hold on, somebody else coming in. Last week we talked about the end of King David's reign. You'll remember that David was anointed by God to take over for Saul, who had displeased God. And so God told Saul that he would not be the first of the dynasty. He gave that privilege to David. David also displeased God, and God kept his promise about being a dynasty to David, but that dynasty was destined to be very troubled, and we saw some of that last week. As David got to the end of his life, the monarchy was unstable. One of his sons held a coronation for himself, while Nathan, his prophet, and Bathsheba, his wife, were pushing for Solomon to be the next king, and that's who was chosen to be the king after David. Solomon's an interesting character. He reigned for 40 years. Israel was wealthy and secure, but Solomon got a little caught up in that. His big achievement was building the temple, which was the focal point of Jewish worship, and it became the place where the ark was housed, but also the symbolic home of God and also of Jewish worship. And so that temple is a critical place, and it plays a critical role in the development of Israel over this time. Solomon was not very sincere in his faith. He had too much money, too much power, too much awareness of opportunities for pleasure as a king, and so he was married to 300 women. He had 600 what they call concubines. I think we would have a less benign sounding name for those now, but that was his life. And so even though he was the one that built the temple, Solomon is not necessarily ever known for his sincere faith and practice. Israel got very wealthy under Solomon, but it wasn't evenly distributed. And I think this part is important for us to remember, because as we look at the Old Testament prophets, it's important to God Not that everyone has the same, but that everyone has enough. That ends up being a fairly biblical understanding of what justice means. Justice is not everyone having the same. It's everyone having enough. And I think that carries through to today. And when you say things like that, it's easy to get accused of being political or politicizing the faith, but it's rooted in the Hebrew scriptures, and it's rooted in the Jewish and in the Christian tradition. That's something that's important. That was not the case under Solomon's reign, and there are signs of unrest and unhappiness during that time, but they don't really explode until Solomon dies. His son Rehoboam becomes king, but almost instantly, the tensions that had been kept under the surface during his reign exploded. A guy named Jeroboam, not Rehoboam. Rehoboam is Solomon's son who became king. Another man named Jeroboam led a revolt in the north, and then he has to leave and go to Egypt to escape Rehoboam's punishment. Jeroboam returns, and he takes the 10 northern tribes. He declares independence, and they become their own nation. They retain the name Israel. The southern kingdom, which was always dominated by people from one tribe, by people from Judah, took the name Judah. So in a lot of ways, it's a huge step back in unity for the people of God. They had worked hard to take the 12 tribes and unify themselves into a nation, and it took one generation, really, after David, before that's ruined. And so Jeroboam declares independence. That cuts all the 10 northern tribes off from Jerusalem and from the temple. And so Jeroboam starts to build alternate shrines in the northern kingdoms, places for worship. That's an important detail even up into the New Testament, because those are the Samaritans, the people that worshiped on a different mountain, at some place other than the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So the history of the monarchy after that is pretty dark. There's so much treachery. We could do a whole evening or two on the treachery in the monarchies of both Israel and Judah. But that didn't seem like all that edifying a way to spend a couple of Thursday nights. So we're going to skip some of those and look at one of the kings that I think is held up as an example of a faithful king, someone who undergoes a transformation during his recorded life, and someone who does what is expected of him as God, as the king of God's people. And so his name is Josiah. I teased him a little bit last week, but we're going to talk a bit about him. Now, this is probably a century or two after Solomon, maybe 3 centuries after Solomon. So we've had these monarchies, treachery after treachery, occasionally a good king, but for the most part, not so much. These are not great years for the people of God. And by the time Josiah comes to the throne, Judah, the southern kingdom, was basically a vassal state. It was basically had been conquered by a more powerful neighbor. Now, it hadn't really been conquered as much as they had said, basically, we'll do what you tell us so that you don't destroy us. And in ancient times, what that meant was Judah, which was the southern kingdom in what had been Israel, was actually paying tribute to Assyria to keep them from coming in and wiping them out. So they'd been at war off and on with the Assyrian Empire. And just remember what we talked about in the beginning, that the Assyrian Empire, they're the ones that about a century or so before this wipe out the northern kingdom. So there are still faithful believers. There are still Jews in the northern kingdom, but there's none of the government or infrastructure that there had been up until the 8th century BC, when the Assyrian Empire conquered them. Judah, even though it was smaller, was stronger and held off the Assyrians and basically battled them to that point where they just paid a tax to Assyria in order to continue to function as Judah. And so it's the Assyrians who conquer the Northern Empire, but in the mid 7th century BC, the Assyrian Empire basically collapses under its own weight. It has spread itself out too far. It has started too many wars. It went the way of most ancient empires. It got overextended, and in the end, it couldn't sustain itself. The new bully in town would be the Babylonian Empire. But there's a little bit of a gap between the downturn in the Assyrian Empire and the rise of the Babylonian Empire, and that it's in that gap where Josiah becomes king of Judah. Josiah is a kid, and I'm going to read some stretches from his story, but Josiah is really young. I think he's 8 years old or something when he becomes king, and he pardon me just a second as I flip to this. I'm going to read a little bit from 2 Chronicles 34. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of his story. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 31 years in Jerusalem. He did what was right in Yahweh's eyes and walked in the ways of his ancestor David, not deviating from it even a bit to the right or to the left. In the 8th year of his rule, while he was still just a boy, he began to seek the God of his ancestor David, and in the 12th year, he began purifying Judah and Jerusalem of the shrines, sacred poles, idols, and images. Now, that requires a little bit of background. A few important things about Josiah's reign. Judah had largely, during all that tumult and all that treachery between king after king after king, Judah had taken on some of the gods of the Assyrian Empire and even some of the ancient gods of Canaan. And so in the text, actually, this translation doesn't say it, but in the text, there's an Asherah pole, and they were all over the place. They were little shrines where people could stop and worship the Canaanite gods. This was the state of Judah when Josiah became king. And but that little formula is oftentimes the way in Chronicles we learn about a new king. This king came, he was this age when he took over, he reigned for this many years, and he did evil in the sight of Yahweh, or he did right but in the sight of Yahweh. Josiah is one of the rare good kings. Of course, he's 8 years old, so I don't know how evil he could have been, but this is looking back on his life. This is the historian's distance. And so they're writing about Josiah after Josiah's reign. I always make this distinction. This is history, not journalism, right? This is not somebody taking notes while it's happening and writing it down. This is somebody assessing a reign in retrospect. And that retrospect was probably during exile. So Josiah comes to the throne. He starts tearing down the shrines and the images and all those things that represented either the Assyrian religions or the Canaanite gods. And he starts tearing those down, and that's seen as a sign of him living up to the covenant that God had made with his people. Here's something interesting. The prophet who comes into office about midway through Josiah's reign is Jeremiah. Jeremiah, who is the bad news prophet. Jeremiah is the one who has grown up in this era where Judah was corrupted by other religions. And remember, this is not Judah and Israel. They were not meant to be pluralistic, religious pluralist societies. They were meant to be places where the nation followed the covenant with God and God protected them. That's different from any of our nations now, including Israel. This was a different way of governance. This was a different way of them gathering themselves. And so when I say they stamped out all the other religions, that's not a model for us today. That's just how it was then. This was meant to be a country built around its covenant relationship with Yahweh. And when it wasn't is when it went off the rails. And when it did do that is when it prospered and had safety and security and a little bit of shalom. So Josiah comes, he destroys all of these other things, and he starts to repair and restore Solomon's temple, which already, after just a couple of hundred years, had fallen into disrepair. And this is a key part of the story, because while restoring the temple, a workman found a copy of the Torah. In other words, a workman found a Bible that nobody had read in generations. And that's a pretty critical part of the story. Listen to how they tell this story. While they were bringing out the money that had been brought into the Lord's temple, Hilkiah the priest found the instruction scroll that Yahweh had given through Moses. Hilkiah told the secretary, "I have found the instruction roll in the Lord's temple." Now, first, you got to note their surprise. It's like saying, "I found a Bible in the church." They find, when they say the Lord's instruction roll, they're talking about the Torah. They're talking about the scrolls that contain the earliest writings that unified the Jewish people, the Israelite people. Hilkiah turns the scroll over to another person who brought it to the king. "Your servants are doing everything you've asked them to. They've released the money that was found in the temple, and they've handed it over to the supervisors and to the workers." That's an interesting detail. As Josiah is supervising the restoration of the temple, they find money. They find money that had been given for the purpose of maintaining the temple, but never used. And what they do is they distribute it to the workers. Now, in some rooms, that's going to get me in trouble to point that out, but I think since we're on Zoom, this is a safe space. But it's important that Josiah had that sense of justice. These are the guys doing the work. They should be the ones getting the money. That's not the way Solomon ran things. And so instantly here, you're meant to see an improvement in the way that King Josiah rules. And so Josiah renews the covenant with Yahweh, and he destroys the other shrines. And eventually, Josiah even renews the annual celebration of Passover, which is something that the people of God had allowed to fall away. It's like us not having Christmas or Easter anymore, just because we forget or we don't care anymore. Passover was one of the central holy days for the people of God. Remember, Passover commemorates the release from slavery of Israel, of all of God's people, all the Hebrews from Egypt. And not only that, but their protection as the plagues came down on Egypt in order to let them go. Passover is a central part of Israel's self-identity and their self-understanding of who they are in relationship to God. And they weren't even celebrating it anymore. So in 2 Chronicles 35, you see this. Then Josiah celebrated the Lord's Passover in Jerusalem. They slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th day of the first month. He assigned the priests to their post, encouraging them to fulfill their responsibilities in the Lord's temple. Next, Josiah ordered the Levites, who were holy to the Lord and who instructed all Israel. He said, "Put the holy chest in the temple built by Israel's King Solomon, David's son. You don't need to carry it around on your shoulders anymore. Now go serve the Lord your God and his people Israel." So these are huge changes. While the faith of the nation had eroded away literally to nothing, there were still faithful priests carrying around the Ark of the Covenant, saying, this is still what unifies us. And what Josiah says is, look, put it back in the temple, which has now been restored, and go and serve the people. Now, Matthew 25 eventually is going to remind us, or Matthew 22 is going to remind us that that we're meant to love God and love our neighbors, right? And notice what Josiah says to the priests: go out, serve the Lord your God and his people Israel. Go out and love God and love others. And presumably he said, and do things. That's just for Jen, who's not here. And so this is a huge thing. One of the pieces of the story that I skipped over, but I think is important. When Josiah's workmen found the Torah, Josiah gathered everyone in Jerusalem and he had the priests read it out loud to them. For many of these people, it would have been the first time they ever heard the scriptures read. Now, it's easy for us to look back on Israel's history as this unbroken line, but this is an example of just how deeply that line had been broken. God's people standing in the holy city where God lived on earth in the shadow of the temple were hearing God's word for the first time. They were hearing Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Those books read out loud from morning until night, out loud. And it's in that context that Josiah, as the king, renews the covenant of Judah with God, and that lasts as long as his reign. It's in Josiah that we see a commitment to the written word that we can understand, right? We get the idea that reading our Bible is one of the things we're meant to do as people who follow God, because that's where God reveals himself. So we have a connection with Israel or with Judah under Josiah. They had this renewed understanding that reading the written word was an important part of the life of faith. He read the words, he led his people to follow God's teaching. He is the last of the good king, the last of the good kings of Judah. Remember that the northern kingdom of Samaria or Israel, that's already gone. That's been gone for 150 years. Josiah is the last good king of Judah. In chapter 36 of 2 Chronicles, we see the last of the kings. I'm just going to summarize these because they all tell a part of the story, and then we're going to talk about the end of the story for Judah in that area. These names are tricky. Jehoahaz is 23 when he became king. He ruled for 3 months in Jerusalem. The king of Egypt came in and removed him from his office in Jerusalem. The Egyptian king imposed a fine on the land totaling 100 kikars of silver and 1 kikar of gold. I don't know what that measurement is, but if it's a national punishment, it's probably a lot. Then the king of Egypt made Jehoahaz's brother Eliakim king of Judah and Jerusalem and changed his name to Jehoiakim. There are a handful of stories in the Old Testament and the New Testament where God changes somebody's name. Here's one where the king of Egypt conquers Judah, changes the king, and then changes the new king's name. It's a sign that they have sunk that low. And so Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the Lord's eyes. We're going to talk a little bit about the attacks on Jerusalem, but it's that king that suffers the first attack from Nebuchadnezzar. The next king, Jehoiakim, was 18 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 3 months in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the Lord's eyes. After him was Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the Lord God's eyes, and did not submit before the prophet Jeremiah, who spoke for Yahweh. It's an interesting thing. Jeremiah is the prophet from about a third of the way through Josiah's reign until Judah gets carted off into exile by Babylon. It's Jeremiah who is the constant reminder of bad news. In other words, God's word to this bad king after bad king after bad king. And so Jeremiah is still the prophet. Jeremiah is almost ruthlessly abused in that role. And I'm just going to read you one little piece here from Jeremiah chapter 20. So that last king, Zedekiah, who was the last king of Judah, had a priest named Pashur, and he was the one in charge of the Lord's temple under this bad king. When the priest Pashur heard Jeremiah prophesying these words, he beat the prophet and detained him in confinement in the upper Benjamin gate in the Lord's temple. The next day, when he released Jeremiah from confinement, Jeremiah said to him, "The Lord has changed your name from Pashur to Panic Lurks Everywhere." Another name change. The Lord proclaims, "I'm going to strike panic into your heart and into the hearts of your friends. You will watch as they fall in battle to their enemies. I will hand over all Judah to the king of Babylon, who will exile some to Babylon and slaughter others." So this is clearly now the end of the monarchy. This is how the monarchy ends. Bad king after bad king after bad king. And then finally, the prophet Jeremiah trying to tell them, look, follow God like Josiah did, and none of these bad things will happen to you. And the kings don't listen. So in the year 598 BC, Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon attacked Jerusalem. He plundered part of the city, and he did make it into the temple and steal some of the things that were in the temple. 10 years later, in 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem for 30 months. That's 2 years. That's 2.5 years, right? Am I doing my math right? 2.5 years. Jerusalem is besieged, and in an ancient siege, you've got the army covering all the exits and keeping everybody in. And so what happens on the inside is that people starve, people fight for food. Oftentimes, people fight against each other as much as the enemy outside the walls. But he besieged Jerusalem, and this time, when he made his way in, he destroyed the city and he destroyed Solomon's temple. That is a huge death blow to the people of Israel and the people of Judah. King Zedekiah, who was the king at that time, he's defeated in the battle, and the elites, anybody who was had a business or wealth or education, they were the ones taken into exile. It's roughly about 20% of the population of Jerusalem and Judah is carted off into exile. The rest are left there, only with no leaders, no educated people, none of the elites stayed. They were the ones who were taken into exile. Jeremiah remains the prophet of God's people, even into exile. And he's one who continues to have to say, I told you this would happen. I told you this would happen. I told you this would happen. And then there's a transition to, okay, now turn back to God. Now turn back to God. And you've all seen the hopeful passages in Jeremiah because there aren't many of them. But you know the passages like, I know the plans I have for you, right? Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. These are Jeremiah's communication of God's promises to his people after they've been punished. And so Jeremiah stays the prophet of Judah even into the exile. And that is the end of what had been Israel and then was Israel and Judah. This represents the end of that as an entity until King Cyrus of Persia releases God's people to go back to Judah and to rebuild the walls and the city and the temple. So this is the story. That's how the monarchy of the Israelites rises, but mostly falls, and how God's people get taken into exile. It's in that exile, after all these things have happened, all the treachery, all the kings rising and falling, sons killing fathers, fathers killing sons, brothers killing brothers to try and take the throne. After all of this, and after two separate empires conquer the two parts of God's people, both Israel and Judah, after all that happens, a ragtag group of people come back from exile, and it's their task to rebuild the city and the temple. And that's what's happening in Ezra and Nehemiah. So we'll look at those next week. But I just want to make a couple of points because I think Josiah has always been my favorite of the king stories, because he's third grade when he takes the throne. He's 8 years old, but he has a better inner compass than the grown-ups who preceded him or followed him. Remember, he's already restoring the temple when they find the Torah. He already knows we have allowed the temple to fall into disrepair. It's important to restore it, even if he didn't quite understand why. And it's in that process of restoring God's house on earth that the Torah is found. The Torah is read first to the inner circle at the court, and then to all the people. And it's in the reading of the Torah that God's people renew their covenant with God. That's such an important thing. And to me, it is so sad that it didn't last. But it's part of the telling of the story of Israel in retrospect. Remember, this is one of the books written either during or at the end or after the exile. And so they're looking back, and they can't only tell the bad stories. They've got to reserve what is an unusually long space in Chronicles for the story of Josiah, because that's the story they want to latch onto when they get to rebuild the city and the temple. They want to be like Josiah. They want to renew their faith. They want to have respect for God's house on earth. They want to read the Torah, and they want to renew their covenant with God. And that's what the chroniclers, that's what they end up being able to teach to the people after they get to come back from exile. So that coming back from exile is an important thing because it's very different than what happens to the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is conquered and they don't get to come back. They're dispersed over the region. Some of them come back, but not as an entity, not as a government or a structure. They're just people living in the wilderness that were there, farmers and fishermen and that sort of thing. But the people of the southern kingdom get to come back. And that's important because our understanding of Jewishness comes from Judah. It does not come from the northern tribes. Our understanding of what it means to be Hebrew and what it means to be an Israelite and what it means to be Jewish, even up to this day, that can be traced in an unbroken line back to Judah restoring the city of Jerusalem after the exile. Now, on the one hand, that's great for the people of Judah, and they did retain and pass on the Jewish scriptures and the traditions and the faith. It's awfully sad that we don't have the influence as much of the Northern Kingdom. The Northern Kingdom, they were part of the 12 tribes too. They just weren't as powerful as Judah. And so we have an incomplete story of Jewishness, but the story we have came from the Southern Kingdom. And so that means that their written record of the Torah is the one we have, not the Northern Kingdom. Matter of fact, there are biblical scholars who trace the influence of the fragments that may have come from Samaria, from the Northern Kingdom, and their influence on the Hebrew scriptures. But overwhelmingly, and I don't think I would be overstating it to say probably 80% of what we understand about the Torah and the writings and the prophets came from the Southern Kingdom. And so I think that ends up being where the history of that region and the role that major empires played. The Assyrian Empire off and on had power for 1,500 years in that region. The Babylonian Empire, which ends up defeating the Assyrian Empire at one point, they rule for centuries too. They have their own rule, and a lot of the area where they are is the area now where Iraq is. Where if you ever took a Western civilization class in college, you know that so much focus is spent on that Fertile Crescent, right? Between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, that it's there where people went from nomads to being people who planted things and lived seasonally, lived annually in the same place. And so Western civilization really starts in that area. That's in the heart of the Babylonian Empire, which had also been a part of the Assyrian Empire before it. And so, and interestingly enough, when we get to the book of Jonah, Nineveh is right in the heart of Babylon. Nineveh is the city where God tells Jonah, go and tell them, go and share the blessings of God with them. In other words, go do your part of the covenant with the people of Nineveh. Jonah doesn't like the people of Nineveh. And so he runs away. And then you all know the story because we tell it to our kids, right? A big fish comes, swallows Jonah, spits him back up, and then he shares the message with these people he doesn't like, and lo and behold, they believe it. And the funniest part of that story is how it ends. Jonah, grumbling, still mad that he had to do it, sitting under a tree while God's blessings are extended to the people of Nineveh. Nineveh is a city in that region that ended up being where the exile took place. And so we'll look at a little bit more of that. I think next week we'll look, we'll breeze through the history of the return to Jerusalem in Ezra and Nehemiah. And then I think we'll probably beyond that, we'll spend some time in the Psalms. I think we can do that in an evening. That sounds strange since there's 150 of them, but trust me, we're not going to read every Psalm on that Thursday night. And then we're going to look at some of the prophets and connect them with some of the kings that we've talked about. And then we'll kind of wrap up the Old Testament, and then there'll be some talk about how we move into the New Testament after that. So we probably still have a month before we get to the New Testament, and we might take a little break right around Holy Week. But anyway, if that's okay with you, if that pace is okay with you, that's where we're headed. I'm going to unmute you now. and see what you have to say.
Well, that's a nice summary of the whole batch of stories.
Sure is.
Hey, unmute yourself, John.
I know.
Yeah.
Hopefully not too jumbled, but what I wanted to do is tell the stories that seem disconnected and then show where they intersect a little bit and how they impact our understanding.
That was interesting.
Any questions or comments about that? Oh, Margot.
Mike, did somebody else want to say something first?
Oh, Margot.
Okay. So later on, when you're talking about the prophets and the kings, I had just read something last week about this prophet Huldah with Josiah.
Yes.
And will she come into the story later, or?
I can go back to her. The prophet that ends up being the one. I mean, Josiah is most associated with Jeremiah, but spell that one for. Is that HOLD?
HULDA. And she's in chapter 34
Okay.
of Second Chronicles.
Yeah.
It looks like they took the scroll, whatever the scroll was, to her for verification or validation,
Yeah.
and then she said, things are going to get, all this destruction has been proclaimed, but because you've humbled your heart and stuff, things are going to get better.
Yeah. It's interesting because her she was known and comes down in Jewish history as somebody of great faith and moral character and broad knowledge of the Torah, which goes against a lot of what we've seen in more recent centuries about women weren't allowed to read the Torah. In some strict Jewish traditions, they're every bit as strict about women learning how to read as the fanatical wing of Islam is about women learning to read and learning Quran. And so it's nice to see she's the last of the 7 prophets of the Old Testament. And so that's great. I'm glad you reminded me of that. I had read a little bit about her before, but I had focused on the story in Chronicles, and I think she's in 2 Kings.
Well, she's in both places.
Is she in both places? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for pointing her out. That's good.
Well, we want to have girls in the story when we can.
We do, and I will remind you of how much we spent on Deborah and my favorites. Deborah is still one of my favorite women in the Bible. We probably ought to do Esther. We ought to spend. Ruth ended up being such a fun one to spend time in, but Esther's an interesting story because it's the answer to a trivia question, which is name a book of the Bible where God is not mentioned, and it's Esther.
Yeah.
We'll take a look at Esther too. And next week, I think just for continuity with this week, we'll do Ezra and Nehemiah, and then we'll find our way to Esther, and then work our way into the other writings, and then summarize some of the prophets. How many of you were around when we went through Amos? Okay, so not everybody, but the prophets have a wonderfully consistent message. Right? It's you worship faithfully, administer justice, and extend the covenant to your neighbors. And so the prophets are sometimes they have differences in the stories they tell and the images that they use, but oftentimes their stories are pretty consistent. Even Jeremiah here saying, if you would just worship God and follow the covenant, it would be, you wouldn't have to have this punishment. And so for that, they locked him in a sewer for a couple of days, and he still preached from there. The Bible calls it euphemistically a cistern.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, but putting somebody in a pool of water just doesn't seem like much of a punishment.
No.
So Thanks for that, Margot. Any other questions about this, or what jumps out at you at this? Susan, please.
I guess what jumps out at me is it gives me hope for our current state of faithfulness in our country. And I'll just use the US because it obviously, the Jewish people had the ups and downs and the moving away from and being more consistent with God's teachings. And I feel like it's kind of the whole question right now in terms of Christianity, that so many groups have gotten what I would say is away from the basic tenets of what Jesus is teaching. And so there's hope that they'll come back.
There is hope, and there's a beautiful story we'll see next week that I love to read that story, so I'll read that whole text for us. But that happens when the people of God renew their covenant in the Jerusalem that they are allowed to come back to. That it's a beautiful moment in the story and in the history, and it's interesting because God's people allowed the core of the faith to be eroded as they, in some ways, as they got on with the business of everyday life. And that's too bad, because that doesn't always happen. I think the story of Ruth is a reminder that faithful people were living out the covenant in the regular rhythm of life. There's businesses, there's business transacted, there's marriages happening, there are families reunified, all within the umbrella of covenant life. It's when Israel falls away from that they stray and that they get punished, either losing in battle or losing some of their land, or ultimately getting carted off into exile. I think for us, as we are part of a country that has a rich Christian history, but oftentimes, and I'm going to put my American historian hat on here, not in the straight line that we've been taught. Here's the thing they don't teach us very often, is that the people who left Britain and some of the other countries to escape the heavy-handed church there were the people who didn't want to go to church. And so church membership in the early colonies is under 15%.
Well,
The heyday of American Christianity is in the 1800s. There's an awakening, a first great awakening that happens just before the revolution, but it's small in numbers. It just goes deep. There are a lot of the elites, a lot of the scholars of the time and political leaders were caught up in this in the 1740s and 1750s. It's not until the early 1800s that you have the second great awakening, which isn't as deep, but it's wide. And that is the first mass expansion of the Christian faith in American history. Folks, that's 70 years after the Declaration of Independence. When life expectancy is maybe 50 years, that's a long time. So in other words, sometimes we get taught that America was a Christian country and it's just been in this steady descent. The real story is so much more interesting than that. The nation is founded largely by dissenters who didn't have much patience for traditional Christianity, even the founders. But it's in fits and starts, Christianity takes dominance, but it's not till the 1800s. And so the real story is more interesting. The problem with that is that it does, after the Civil War, become tied to what it means to be an American. And anytime you confuse those two, you're in trouble. When you confuse your national identity with your faith identity, you have strayed over a line that it's very hard to come back from. And so some of the renewal movements that are happening now, even the one at Asbury, some of the if you pay attention to Christian websites and read Christian magazines, there's a lot of talk about something called deconstruction. And what that, if your eyes are glazing over right now, bear with me for like 3 minutes. If deconstruction is taking apart the faith you grew up with, or the one that you have almost just by habit, and rebuilding it with a faith that's rooted in the person of Christ. And oftentimes, some of the things that you leave behind were some of the most precious things you thought you had. And that process is happening now primarily with people sort of 35 and under. That is a huge movement right now. And there are amazing authors. Even Pete Enns is one of the authors that's writing things that are supporting people who are rethinking their faith. Rachel Held Evans, just to make sure we're mentioning the women. Nadia Bolz-Weber. If these are names that are unfamiliar to you, send me an email and I'll send you some author names, and with a couple of parental warnings for one of them who tends to write in pretty earthy language.
Yeah, our favorite book, Susan.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. So that's
And also the Nadia Escobedo Frank. We just went to her installation as a bishop. She's written 7 books, and one of them is exactly what you're talking about. At some point, you have to just say, "I'm done," and then start all over again and come afresh and come anew.
Yep. Yeah.
Susan, can you hold up that book?
Was that? Yeah, that's Nadia Bolz-Weber. It's called Accidental Saints.
Oh, yeah, yeah. One other quick one, John.
Sure.
Susan, in response to something you just said, check out the most recent Atlantic magazine. There's an essay in there by Tim Keller called How American Christianity Can Grow Again.
Yep.
It's an amazing commentary on the mess we've gotten ourselves in with denominations and schisms and everything else.
Yeah.
And John, you said it very well. The Reformation, it's a gift that keeps on giving. And this whole denominational mess is fascinating, but check out the Tim Keller essay. It's really good.
I do have that, and I have it stored on my computer. It's going to show up in a sermon or a lesson at some point coming up. And Tim Keller is part of a tradition that has that split off from the main Presbyterian tradition back in the 20s and 30s, but had a particular vision for how to do ministry among young professionals in, of all places, godless Manhattan, and grew an amazing church that has spun out, I'm not exaggerating here, maybe 1,000 church planters around the world, maybe more. And yes, there are things that his tradition talks about that I don't agree with, but you cannot, you just can't deny the impact of the ministry that Tim Keller's had. And I think he's been trying to pull his tradition a little bit more toward the center over time. And now he's coming sort of to the end of his professional, and maybe even I think he's getting older, but I'm glad that he wrote for such a wide audience, and it's a testament to his clout that basically an evangelical Presbyterian got to write an article in the Atlantic.
Yeah, and he doesn't pull any punches. There's blame to go around all over.
But if you do want some of the books that talk about this, there are some people who are doing some interesting thinking about what it means to be the faith if you filter out all the nonsense. And the first step to that is agreeing that some of that stuff is nonsense. And then the second step is to kind of dismantle that in your own way of thinking about who God is and who you are in relationship to God, because that changes who you are in relationship because of God to the world. Right? And so what's our definition of shalom? The webbing together of God, humans, and creation in justice, fulfillment, and delight. So Nadia Bolz-Weber is one, Rachel Held Evans is one. My good friend who is friends with both of them, Tony Jones, is writing interesting stuff. He wrote a book called Did God Kill Jesus? Which was a rethinking of the way we talk about the cross and what that means and how people hear that from different cultures. And it's very interesting stuff. But and all of these people are writing in really accessible language. They have their academic credentials, but they don't write for the academy, which is a whole jargony thing that's meaningless to most people. So you got me on a roll there at the end. Bert, please.
Well, I'd like to go back to the topic I discussed at the end of last week. That is the death of, or the unanointing of Saul. So I've been reading this book, as I mentioned, out of my daughter's seminary library, reading Samuel. And the authors in there really go out on some interesting tangents. And for instance, Saul is told by Samuel that God doesn't like you anymore. You're no longer anointed. And some of the commentators on this say, well, now, was that Samuel talking or was that God? That Samuel was actually somebody who wanted to control the king. He wanted a docile king that he could control. Well, that's an interesting point of view. So then we have the story that says that Saul fell on his own sword. He killed himself so that the Philistines wouldn't do it and make big joke out of it. And then the thing I talked about last week was how another soldier came to David and said, Saul asked me to kill him, and I did. Well, and David ended up killing this messenger. Well, you see, that isn't just a different version of the story. The young soldier who came and said that was lying, and David knew it. And he, like others, there were two other guys that David killed because they reported something. They were seeking favor from David. They wanted to get in his inner circle by pulling this off. And David wasn't having anything to do with it. And that is why the messenger was killed, as well as for defiling Saul and taking some of his property.
Yeah, and I think you said defiling somebody who David still saw as anointed.
Yes.
And so, I think remembering that these stories are written after the fact, and that until the 1700s, there is no kind of internal burden on the part of historians to get all the facts right. The main thing is to get the point across and to shape the narrative so that it makes your point. That's a different way of telling history. The way that everybody on my screen here, we have all grown up with an understanding of history that you got to go into the original documents. You have to find out what really happened and then tell the story. You can have a point of view, but you can't make up stuff. If I make up things, my book or my articles don't get published, or my dissertation doesn't pass unless I can prove that I used sources. That's a very different way of writing history than we see in the Bible, and also outside of the Bible, but in ancient times. The great epic poems about battles are always sung by the winners. The losers are dead. No one is interested in telling the dead guy's story. So you tell the story of the winners, and oftentimes historians now have to go and read those poems and try and see through them into the actual facts of what happened. And some people approach the Bible stories with too much skepticism. They forget that they're not reading modern history. They're reading ancient sagas of king after king after king that are told as part of a national story. And those are the stories in Samuel and Kings and in Chronicles. They were meant to define Jewishness for people who had just been carted off into exile. And so I don't know if I have the same. I don't have the book you're talking about, but is it written by a woman, Johanna Wick Boss?
Exactly.
Yeah, I just looked that one up. I didn't know that, folks. I'm not trying to.
And she cites all kinds of people, including Brueggemann and other highfalutin scholars.
Yeah, and she's a Presbyterian scholar at a Presbyterian seminary,
Louisville.
At Louisville, yeah. So anyway, I think that's interesting, Bert. Keep bringing us stuff from that. Although we're moving on past Samuel, so you might have to find another book out of
Right.
the library to read.
That'll be the end of Samuel.
Let me close us in prayer. God, as we enter into this season of Lent, and this season of maybe depriving ourselves of something or adding something into our daily life that reminds us of you, we're grateful that we still get to be able to study your words and see what you would have us know from those. As we continue through these 40 plus days, bring us closer to you so that we can celebrate your resurrection with all the joy we can muster. We pray this in your son's name. Amen. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Have a great
Night.
evening.
Thank you.
Sunday.